Hi, everybody. So we're going to start our new unit talking about cells. And before we get into depth of talking about cells, we should talk a little bit about how we know about cells. Now, we know that all living things are made of cells, which in turn are made of atoms, right? So carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen are organized into lipids and carbohydrates and proteins and water and carbon dioxide and oxygen and all those biochemical compounds. And those are organized into cells, right, that make up living things. But how do we know that? How do we know that all living things are made of cells? We looked. We took a little piece of living animal or plant and put it on a microscope and looked in the microscope and boom, saw little boxes. This guy right here, Robert Hooke, took a little bit of plant, bark of a cork tree, put it on a microscope, looked in, saw little teeny tiny boxes, called them cells, and said, wow, cork is made of cells. And then another dude took some other living things and put them on a microscope and looked in and was like, wow, they're made of like these ovally things. Well, those must be also cells. And every time that we took a piece of a living thing and put it on a microscope and we looked in, boom, looked like cells. And so eventually, after taking a little bit of an animal, a cow, and a little bit of a human, and a little bit of a plant, of a tree, and a flower, and we took a little bit of one-celled organisms and shrimp and fish, and right, we took all these different things. We kept putting them on the microscope, and boom, it was made of cells. And so finally, we said, hey, all living things are made of cells. Do we know that? Do we know without a doubt that all living things are made of cells just because every living thing that we've put on a microscope was made of little boxy things that we called cells? Of course not. Of course not. We don't know that, but we started to conclude it after a while. We're like, hey, all living things must be made of cells because every bit of evidence suggests that every time we take a living thing and put it on the microscope, it's made of cells. Actually, it turns out, eventually we made a microscope strong enough. We put something on the microscope that we thought was living, and we put it on there, and it wasn't made of cells. We decided, well, maybe it's not living. Silly, right? Silly. Nature's going to do what nature does, and we try to make distinctions and classifications of things that are living and non-living, but nature's going to do whatever the heck it does. We do know that living things, by and large, are made of little boxy things that we call cells. We also know that cells are what do the living. So burning sugar to break down energy. You have energy to do stuff. I have energy to speak to you, right? All of that takes energy. It's really the cells at the cell level breaking sugar down to get energy. It's the cells doing the growing. It's the cells that are doing the thinking. It's the cells that are doing the dancing because it's making the muscles contract. Those are all cells working. So all the functions of life are done by cells. And cells only come from pre-existing cells. They're not going to come poof out of nothingness. We'll talk about that a lot more later on in the year. So let's talk about some of the exceptions to this. As I just said, you know, at one point we made a microscope strong enough, we put something living on the microscope and it wasn't made of cells. What is that? Viruses. This right here is a virus called a bacteriophage. It's actually a virus that makes bacteria sick. When you think of bacteria as making you sick, and they cause infections. Those are cells, bacteria. Okay, you can imagine that cell goes way, way beyond the screen here. And this is a little portion of the bacterial cell being infected by a virus. Now, this is the tiniest cell that exists in a bacterial cell. This is way smaller than a cell. It's not made of cells. It's actually just a protein on the outside and some nucleic material inside. So very tiny, very, 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 very tiny, much smaller than a cell. So it's a virus. So we say it's an exception. Sometimes we say it's living and it's just not made of cells. It's an exception, or we even just go ahead and say, it's not living. This right here is the infamous COVID-19, or that's actually not necessarily COVID-19, but it's a coronavirus, of which COVID-19 is one. And this right here is one cell that also will go way beyond the screen in size. And these viruses are tiny, tiny, not made of cells. So they're an exception to the cell theory. Mitochondria and chloroplasts that we'll talk about later are parts of cells. They're organelles, like the nucleus or the cell membrane. They're parts inside of the cell. So they're not made of cells, but they also act living. They can reproduce on their own. They have some other functions that they do on their own that seem like they're living. So they're considered exceptions. And I said cells only come from pre-existing cells, so there's an exception to that. We know on this planet at one point there was no life. We know that. We can look at the fossil record and go down back old enough. There was nothing living on this planet. And then there was something living. So there had to be a first cell, and that has to be an exception. Again, we'll talk about that later. So the cell theory, all living things are made of cells. Cells do all the things that life does, and cells only come from pre-existing cells. And then we have these three exceptions. And let's put this in context. We have levels of organization. What was the teeniest, tiniest things like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen that make up molecules? Those are atoms. Atoms are organized into molecules that are organized into little subparts of cells, like the mitochondria, like the nucleus, like the cell membrane. Those are called organelles. So carbon, hydrogen, oxygen are atoms. Nucleus, mitochondria, ribosomes, those are organelles. We'll talk about them more in detail later on this in this chapter. Those organelles like the nucleus and the mitochondria and the ribosomes all together make up cells, and that's what makes up the living things. Those are organized into tissues. So for example, you can have a whole bunch of the same kind of cells, like muscle cells, all hooked together into a muscle. The muscle is a tissue. Or you can have a whole bunch of bone cells hooked together into bone. You can have skin, they're called epithelial cells, hooked together to make skin. Skin is the tissue, muscle is the tissue. Okay, so a tissue is a group of the same type of cells working together to do a job. And then those tissues, you can have muscle and nerve and bone all hooked together to make an organ. For example, your heart is made of muscle tissue, epithelial tissue, that's the skin type tissue, nervous tissue, blood tissue. That all together makes up an organ like a heart or lung or kidney or liver or brain, okay? And then the organs can be hooked together into groupings, like you can have your mouth and your esophagus and your stomach and your small intestine, your large intestine, all working together in your digestive system or an organ system. So you have your digestive system, you have your nervous system, you have your circulatory system. Each of those systems are made up of organs that are made up of tissues, that are made of cells, that are made of organelles, that are made of atoms. And all those organ systems together, your circulatory system, your respiratory system, your nervous system, your reproductive system, your excretory system, all of those together make up you. You are an organism, okay? And so you also have, you could be, a dog. It's a different organism that would be made up of a bunch of organ systems that are made up of organs and so forth. And you can see there's a really common prefix in all of these words, which is organization. Organelles are the organization of parts of the cells, and organs are the organization of parts of these systems, and organ systems make up organisms, right? So this is all about organization. And so here we have a bunch of atoms that make up a particular molecule that make up this tissue. And the tissue, the atoms make up a cell, and the cell makes up tissue. There we go. So we have these atoms like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, making up cells, like a muscle cell or a nerve cell. And all of the same type of cells, like a whole bunch of muscle cells together, could make up the tissue called muscle. And then a whole bunch of tissues together will make up an organ, like you have muscle tissue and nerve tissue and blood tissue all together, making up the organ of the stomach. And if you put the stomach with the small intestine and the large intestine and liver and a whole bunch of other things here, you're going to have an organ system, in this case, the digestive system. And if you put that inside of a person and you've got the digestive system and you're also going to have the lungs here, the respiratory system, you've got the brain and all the nerves, that's the nervous system. You put all those together and you get an organism. And that's the intro to our cell chapter.